Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's podcast. We've got new episodes coming at you each and every Thursday. And in today's episode, we're going to be covering something that I think is still misunderstood. And in some circles is still controversial. But I don't think it should be misunderstood or controversial. We're going to be talking about sampling rates. 44.1K, 48K, 88.2, 96, 192. These are numbers you've probably heard thrown around if you've been into or interested in audio for any amount of time. And I want to put a lot of the mystery here to bed for you and help make this make so much more sense to you, because it really shouldn't be as complicated as some people make it. And I don't think there needs to be quite as much controversy or quite as much brain power taken up thinking about, am I using the best sample rate? And should I be using a better sample rate? Is this sample rate going to be holding back my project? Could I be getting better sounds with a higher sample rate? How high should I go? This is stuff that really should be fairly simple, and unfortunately to so many of us, it's not. And I think from today's podcast, you're going to come away with a better understanding of just how sample rates really work, what they really mean. We're going to get to explore a couple of great stories along the way, and I think you'll come away with some best practices for how you should be working in your own studio, what's going to make the most sense for you. Let's dive right into it. Right before we do, we got to do the big shout out to our sponsors. So real quick one, I'm going to start off with Sound Toys, because Sound Toys is having a spring sale right now. You have probably heard me shout out Sound Toys in this podcast before, because they have been sponsoring us from the beginning, probably because of one of my favorite creative effects plugin companies out there, period. But they're having a spring sale. And if you have not acted on my advice to go check out soundtoys.com and get some Sound Toys plugins, this is going to be a great excuse for you to do so. The sale only runs right now in the beginning of April. I think it ends April 11th. So you've got a limited amount of time to act, but you can go to soundtoys.com, check out anything that they make absolutely for free. And then if you want to buy something, right now is the time, because they're having a great sale over there. Also want to give a big thank you to SonarWorks, sponsoring once again. SonarWorks making headphones sound a lot better than they would otherwise, making speakers sound a whole lot better than they would otherwise, making rooms sound a whole lot better than they would otherwise. Minimum of expense and fuss. Definitely check them out at sonarworks.com. Last, certainly not least, another one of my favorite creative effects makers, Eventide. Check them out, eventideaudio.com. Check out anything that they make for free in the plugin world. And don't forget to check out some of their very, very cool hardware, rack effects, and stomp boxes. Check them out, eventideaudio.com. So thank you to all you guys, and thank you for joining me. And let's talk about sampling rates. Do they really matter? Is going higher better? To what degree is it better? Are there trade-offs, reasons you wouldn't want to go higher? Are there reasons you'd want to stay lower? Are there reasons you should go higher? We're going to be talking about all of that. But I think first and foremost, to give you a real sense of just what sample rates mean and how much they matter, or if they matter, we've got to take a look at the underlying physics behind sample rates. And I'm going to try to make this as fun and as simple and as non-boring as possible, while making sure not to dumb it down. One of the first things I want to talk about here is a guy named Harry Nyquist. And you may have heard of the Nyquist Theorem or the Nyquist frequency. It is spelled Nyquist. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I've always assumed it's Nyquist. I've never looked it up, but that is a dude's name. And this dude, he worked for Bell Labs in the beginning of the 20th century. And amazing things were happening at Bell Labs in the beginning of the 20th century. This is back when there was like one phone company in all of the United States. They had this giant monopoly. They were practically printing money, and they just hired tons of people to go invent stuff off in the corner somewhere. And they invented some crazy things really early on that weren't shared with the world in many cases until fairly recently. I mean, this guy Nyquist figured out sampling rates and how they work in like 1926 or something like that, I think. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, because digital audio didn't really start coming to fruition until maybe early 80s, maybe 83. There was finally some kind of real digital audio you could maybe point your finger at, and it wasn't very good. But he was able to, writing this stuff down on paper in the 1940s, figure out how digital audio would work in the future. This guy was involved in designing the original prototypes of the fax machine, like the 1920s, long before they ever became a reality. And the stuff that was going on in Bell Labs, man, in the 1960s, they had video phones, and it hasn't been until, I've been an adult that video phones have really become a reality with Skype and, FaceTime and Google Hangouts and all that stuff. So really interesting stuff going on back then. And Nyquist, he had these really simple insights ultimately, because this whole thing that he came up with, this Nyquist theorem, this template for how digital audio would work in the future, is really deceptively simple, because honestly, sound itself is surprisingly simple when you really look at it under the hood. Don't get me wrong, sound waves themselves can be complex and carry complex information. Every word that's coming out of my mouth through your headphones or speakers right now, when you listen to music, you're hearing such variations in color and tone and timbre and tempo. But really, at the end of the day, all that your headphone or speaker is doing is moving back and forth. That's all it can do. The speaker magnet that you have there in your speaker, it can basically tell the speaker, move forward, move back. And that's all it can do. Every single sound that is coming out of my mouth and into your ears right now is because some type of diaphragm, whether it's in your headphones or in your speakers, is moving forward and back. And that's it. And an electrical impulse is telling it to do that. Move forward, move back, move forward, move back. And that is all we can tell the speaker to do. And the word frequency, I'm assuming you've heard the word frequency before, really just means the speed at which that speaker or diaphragm is moving forward and back. And if you ever looked at a waveform in your DAW, it basically goes up and down against a solid center line. And you can think of the center line as being, hey, speaker's in the middle. And whenever the waveform is below that center line, speaker's pulling back. Whenever that waveform is above that center line, speaker's pushing forward. And that's all we can do. Tell it to push forward and pull back. This may seem like an overly simplified way of thinking about it, and in a way it is, but it really does capture the essence of audio. We only really have two dimensions when we are capturing sound. We capture time and intensity. Say you strum a guitar. When you strum a guitar, the face of that guitar is vibrating forwards and back. And it creates waves of compression and rarefaction in the air, where the air molecules right in front of the guitar's face, say, are going to vibrate forward and back. And that air molecule right in front of the guitar, well, it's going to kind of bump into and repel the air molecule next to it, which is going to start vibrating forwards and back. And this creates a chain reaction where that air molecule sets another air molecule vibrating forward and back. And it sets the air molecule in front of it vibrating forward and back until it gets all the way to a microphone. And that microphone diaphragm starts vibrating forward and back. And that microphone changes that vibration in the air to an electrical current that is varying. More voltage, less voltage, more voltage, less voltage against a baseline reference level. And those impulses of more voltage and less voltage go all the way down your microphone cable until it gets to your preamp, until it gets to all of your other analog circuitry. And when it's finally time to get to change this analog signal with, for all intents and purposes, infinite resolution into a digital signal, what we basically do is take snapshots of that analog signal. Now, this is really simple to think about when we are thinking about a very simple sound like a sine wave. Say we have a sine wave at 1,000 hertz. Well, obviously, all the speaker is doing is just moving forward and back, forward and back, forward and back 1,000 times every second. A frequency of 10,000 hertz, right? It would be back and forth 10,000 times per second. But every single complex waveform is just a variation on that. If you were to take something more complex than a sine wave, say a guitar playing a note at 1,000 hertz, well, what's happening is that there's just more stuff going on than just the string in the face of the guitar vibrating back and forth 1,000 times in a second. There are overtones on top of that. So while the string or the face of the guitar is vibrating back and forth 1,000 times per second, there are also sub-variations going on, other frequencies happening at the same time. Sure, it's predominantly vibrating back and forth at 1,000 times per second, but it also has another cycle happening at the same time. It's also vibrating back and forth at 2,000 times per second, and 3,000 times per second, and 4,000 times per second, and 5,000 times per second. So we're actually telling the microphone and the speaker something a little bit more complex. Rather than just move forward, move back, we're saying move forward. But wait a second, I know we were telling you to move forward, but actually just move back a little bit and then move forward some more, but move back a little bit on the way to moving forward and then move forward. And then as you're coming back, move forward again while you're moving back. But then as you're moving back, take a break and move forward again, and so on. So there's more than one cycle happening at once. And that's what makes waveforms complex. This isn't too hard to think about. When the Earth revolves around the sun, you've got one cycle that's happening once every 365 days. But as it's doing that, it's also revolving in place, right? And the day-night cycle is happening once every 24 hours. And then you have the tilt of the Earth. So you have that seasonal cycle where there's kind of a couple of shifts every 365 days to give us 4 seasons. And that's kind of what's happening with sound. Whenever we have one major significant vibration, there's other additional cycles going on at the same time as that main cycle. And all those other cycles that are happening at the same time, well, they are higher frequencies. But here's the thing, there's a limit to our hearing. At a certain point, frequencies get too high for us to hear and too low for us to hear. And all that the sampling rate really does at the end of the day is determine the highest frequency that we can capture in digital audio. And that's all it does. Now, you've probably heard that the range of human hearing is from a low of about 20 hertz, which is just barely a sound. It's just like a super low, thumping in your chest, to a really high of 20,000 hertz. But to be honest, most people can't hear as high as 20,000 hertz in practice. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But because the average range of human hearing is something like a low of 20 hertz to a high of 20,000 hertz, it makes sense to have digital audio that can reproduce at least 20,000 hertz. So it can reproduce the very highest frequencies that we can hear. And in order to do this digitally, that's where that Nyquist Theorem comes in. This theory written out by Harry Nyquist on paper back in the 1940s. And the idea is, if you want to digitally sample or take snapshots of a 20,000 hertz sine wave, you need to take snapshots of it more than 40,000 times per second. How much more? Incrementally more, barely more. We can put the specifics of it aside for just a second. But the reason you need this sampling rate that is double the highest frequency you're trying to capture is because you need to take a snapshot of both the peak and the trough of that wave. And here's the brilliant thing. If you have a snapshot of the peak and the trough of a wave, you can recreate everything that happened between those 2 points with perfect accuracy. Because remember, at the end of the day, all we really need to tell the speaker to do is to move forward and to move back. And in this case, to reproduce a 20,000 hertz wave, we need to tell it to do it 20,000 times per second. And if we have enough snapshots, enough samples of that wave to have captured one of its peaks and one of its troughs, everything in between that doesn't really matter much. Because ultimately, all we really need to tell the speaker is get from point A at 1/20,000th of a second to point B at 2/20,000th of a second. And the speaker will move from point A to point B in 1/20,000th of a second, therefore allowing you to recreate a sine wave of 20,000 hertz. And here's the thing that a lot of people have trouble understanding or accepting at first, and I know I did, and that is that as long as you have a sampling rate that is high enough to recreate a specific frequency, you can recreate that specific frequency perfectly. Going to a higher sampling rate isn't going to make you reproduce that frequency any more perfectly. So, for example, if you have a sampling rate of 40,000 hertz, the frequency 10,000 hertz is going to be reproduced perfectly. Increasing the sampling rate to 80,000 hertz isn't going to make 10,000 hertz be reproduced any more perfectly. It's already being reproduced perfectly. Similarly, if you have a high enough sample rate that you can reproduce 20,000 hertz, going up even higher from 40,000 hertz to 80,000 hertz in your sampling rate isn't going to reproduce 20,000 hertz any more perfectly. All it's going to allow you to do is to capture and play back even higher frequencies. All of the lower frequencies, you are not doing a thing to make them sound any better or any worse. When it comes to sampling rate, either your sampling rate is sufficiently high to record and play back a specific frequency, or it's not. And if your sampling rate isn't high enough to record or play back a particular frequency, well, here's the thing. You've got to get rid of that frequency before you try to digitize it and before you try to sample it. Because if we were to try to take a sampling rate of, say, 44,000, and we try to capture a sine wave of 30,000 with it, it's not high enough to capture 30,000. And there's going to be a lot of problems. It's not just that it won't capture the frequency of 30,000. It will capture it. It'll capture it super distorted with a problem called aliasing, where it basically mistakes that 30,000 hertz sine wave as a lower frequency and creates all sorts of annoying gobbledygook. So every single digital sampler, every single digital to analog converter needs to have something called an anti-aliasing filter. A filter that is going to chop out all frequencies that are too high for the sampling rate to capture properly. Again, if a A to D converter, an analog to digital converter, didn't do this, you'd have tons of crazy distortion. And that's why the standard of 44,100 hertz, 44.1K, became a norm. Because designers wanted a sampling rate that was high enough that it could capture everything that human beings can hear, all the way up to 20,000 hertz, but would allow a little bit of extra wiggle room for them to put in this anti-aliasing filter. And an anti-aliasing filter is basically just a low-pass filter, a high-cut filter that takes out all frequencies above 20,000 hertz and gets rid of them so they're not going to mess up the digital sampling process, that analog to digital conversion process. And this is where some difference in audio quality due to sample rates may actually come into play. Because if you're able to sample instead of at 44.1K, you sample at 48K, well, this gives you even more room to have a decent anti-aliasing filter. And back in the day when all these filters were analog, there is some argument that maybe 48K could be slightly better. Because if you have too steep of a filter, you can have all sorts of weird artifacts. Like there's usually a resonant peak when you have a really steep filter. So if you had a slightly higher sampling rate, well, maybe you wouldn't have that resonant peak because you could have a gentler slope. So the idea was if you're sampling at 44.1K, then either you need a filter with a really steep slope, which could have some artifacts like a little resonant bump, or if you want to have a nice gentle slope on your anti-aliasing filter, it would need to start at a lower frequency. And maybe you'd have to start rolling off frequencies as low as 17K, 18K, 19K. So the very, very top end, maybe on a 44.1K sampling rate, could be a little softer and a little less detailed in the extreme highs than, say, 48K or some higher sampling rate. So this is a reason that, say, 44.1K and 48K could sound different from one another, potentially, in theory. But I think there are two reasons that those differences are a little bit oversold. Number one is that most of us, past a certain age, and that age probably being 30, really probably can't hear 17K, 18K, and 19K anyway. Can 18-year-olds hear those frequencies? Maybe. Can 25-year-olds hear those frequencies? Maybe. Can 30-year-olds hear those frequencies? Maybe some of them. 35-year-olds? Very few of them. 40-year-olds? Fewer of them still. By the time you're 50 or 60, your chances of hearing 16K, 17K, 18K, 19K are pretty darn slim. And that's okay. I mean, a funny thing is about, extremely young people in their, teens and 20s, maybe they can hear those really, really high frequencies, but they probably haven't developed their listening skills well enough to notice that they can hear those frequencies. And I think it's funny that a lot of the people for the longest time who complained about standard sampling rates and really thought that higher and higher sampling rates must be better were often those people in their 40s and 50s and 60s who probably can't even hear those frequencies in many cases. Now, with that said, I want to offer another caveat here, which is not all converters were created equal. So if you have done blind listening tests, not tests where you can fool yourself, where you can listen at 44.1 and then listen at 48 and say, oh yeah, the 48K sounds better. Listen to 88.2, oh yeah, the 88.2K sounds better. If you can see which one is which, you will usually trick your own brain into assuming that the higher number sounds better, even if you can't hear a difference. This is extremely normal. It's called the placebo effect. It happens to all of us. It happens to me, even though I know that it exists. And I'm sure that it happens to you as well. Why am I sure that happens to you as well? Because you're a human being. And one of the studies I always like to bring up in this context is a study about people drinking wine. And there have been tests done on people drinking wine where they will give people one glass of wine that's from a $20 bottle and another glass of wine that's from a $200 bottle, and they'll ask people to rate which wine tastes better. And invariably, something like 4 out of 5 times, people prefer the glass from the $200 bottle of wine over the glass of the $20 bottle of wine. And the joke is, they're both from the same damn bottle. But people really have this effect. And here's the thing. They're not just trying to impress themselves or impress the researcher doing this test on them. They've done this test to people in, brain scan machines where they can see their pleasure centers lighting up. And when they get to tell themselves the story of this is a $20 bottle of wine, and they get to tell themselves the story of this is a $200 bottle of wine, the actual pleasure centers in their brain light up more when they're drinking the quote unquote $200, bottle glass of wine. Their actual perception of the event changes because of the story they get to tell themselves. So it's very important that you listen to these things blind before making decisions. Now, caveat here is not to say that all wine tastes the same. It doesn't. It's not to say that all converters sound the same. They don't necessarily. And it's not to say that every single sampling rate always sounds the same. They don't necessarily. What it is to say is that often our minds and the stories we tell ourselves are much more powerful than our ears. I'm going to say that again because it's super important. As powerful as your ears are, as well trained as they might be, our minds and the stories we tell ourselves are always more powerful than our ears. So if you want to evaluate these differences for yourself, I encourage you to do so. And I encourage you to do it with some blind testing. Now, another reason that I think that some of the benefits of higher sampling rates are oversold is because these aliasing filters I've talked about, which can make a real difference, have gotten better and better and better in recent years. More and more analog anti-aliasing filters aren't being used anymore in most good converters. And instead, they oversample the signal and they apply digital anti-aliasing filters, which allow for steeper cutoff slopes with less resonance. So a 44.1K sampling rate today could sound even more indistinguishable from a 48K or higher sampling rate than in the past. Now, there are some reasonable counter-arguments to everything that I've just said. Most of them, I think, revolve around that idea of an anti-aliasing filter being better or worse in a particular converter. So if you do some blind testing and you find that you've purchased a converter that really does sound better at 88.2 than 44.1K, by all means, use 88.2, use 96K, but do those listening tests for yourself and do them blind. Another good argument in favor of using higher sampling rates is that some plugins, particularly things like compressor plugins, might work better at higher sampling rates. But one of the counter arguments there is today, most plugins that are going to sound better at a higher sampling rate are doing oversampling under the hood. So even if your session is set to 44.1K, under the hood, that synth plugin or saturation plugin or compressor plugin will actually be running at 88.2K or whatever it might be, and doing the processing at that higher sampling rate, getting the benefits of that higher sampling rate for some of these kind of advanced calculations that need to be done, and then spitting back out a sample rate at the end that's at the sampling rate of the rest of your session. And that's a good thing, because if you are going to work at a sampling rate of 88.2K or 96K, you are going to have to use a lot more processing power. You're going to run out of processing power roughly twice as fast if you're doubling your sample rate. You're going to run out of hard drive space roughly twice as fast if you're using a doubly high of a sample rate. If you're using things that run off of batteries, you might be running out of batteries significantly faster at a higher sampling rate. In some software programs, you might run out of track counts twice as quickly. So while there is potential for there to be the tiniest difference in, say, ultra high frequency clarity that you may or may not be able to hear at a slightly higher sample rate, working at these higher sample rates can do things like bog down your workflow. And I'd say that as a general rule, I would rather have less 17, 18K, 19K by a couple dB than have my workflow bogged down, because I can always boost back up those higher frequencies if I need to. But I can't get back creativity, brain power, time, processing power lost to working at too high of a sample rate. Now, with all this said, if you are working on music where you never run into problems with storage space, with processing power, and you just want to be on the safe side and capture these super high frequencies just to have them, go for it. Why not? More power to you. But don't ever let the fear of having too low of a sample rate make you think that your music is going to suffer, because it's not. Your very worst case scenario, which is actually unlikely today because of how good anti-aliasing filters have gotten, is that you might have a little bit less super duper high frequency that most people can't hear. And given the quality of most anti-aliasing filters today, that isn't really too much of a concern at all anymore either. If you want to go into even more detail on the stuff we've talked about today, I have two great articles on this. One is called The Science of Sample Rates, When Higher is Better and When It Isn't. And in that article, I have a great quote of someone who's much smarter than me, especially in these areas, and who makes some of my favorite converters, a guy by the last name of Lavery, Dan Lavery, who designs tremendous converters. Look these guys up, Lavry. And in an article he wrote as far back as 2012, a white paper, he writes, "The notion that more is better may appeal to one's common sense. Presented with analogies such as more pixels for better video or faster clock to speed up computers, one may be misled to believe that faster sampling rates will yield better resolution and detail. These analogies are wrong. The great value offered by Nyquist Theorem is the realization that we have all of the information with 100% of the detail and no distortion without the burden of extra fast sampling. Nyquist pointed out that the sampling rate needs only to exceed twice the signal bandwidth. What is the audio bandwidth? Research shows that musical instruments may produce energy above 20,000 hertz, but there is little sound energy at or above 40,000 hertz. Most microphones do not pick up sound much over 20,000 hertz. Human hearing rarely exceeds 20,000 hertz and certainly does not reach 40,000 hertz. The above suggests that even 88.2 or 96K would be overkill. In fact, all the objections regarding audio sampling at 44.1K are long gone by increasing the sampling rate to about 60,000 hertz. And he wrote this, I would say, before anti-aliasing filters got to the place where they are today, where you could make that argument potentially at a lower than 60,000 hertz sampling rate. So to Lavery, the question was not about whether or not 44,000 is the last stop. It was clear to him that it rests on the cusp of a point of diminishing returns, and that by the time you've reached 60,000 kilohertz, you've exhausted all the theoretical benefits that you could ever add. That is, as long as you're making music for human beings. If you're making music for bats, there is a chance that higher sampling rates could be beneficial. With that said, if you think that it's better to overshoot the mark and waste some power and stability rather than undershoot the mark and potentially leave some theoretical super high frequency audio quality on the table, then switching from something like 44.1K to 88.2K seems like a valid argument. Above that, the arguments get harder and harder for me to think are very sensible, unless for some reason your converter is designed poorly and therefore sounds a lot better at 96K than 88.2K, because it really shouldn't if it's designed properly, in my opinion. In this article that I wrote recapping some of this stuff, I said when a designer like Lavery focuses on making a converter sound great at 44.1K, it's easy for that converter to sound equally good at a higher sampling rate as well. But unfortunately, it does not work the other way around. One last quick thing I want to note is that with extremely high sample rates, things above 96K, there could actually be problems where you could introduce something called intermodulation distortion. I could probably do a whole other podcast just explaining the idea of intermodulation distortion, but long story short is that all the analog playback circuitry that you have going on probably is not equipped to reproduce frequencies much higher than 20,000 hertz without introducing distortion. And if you're feeding a lot of, frequencies much higher than 20,000 hertz, say 60,000 hertz, 70,000 hertz, 80,000 hertz in significant quantities, you could be distorting and creating intermodulation distortion in the analog components that you're playing back. And this could be a problem with something like 192K. I provide a link to a guy named Monty who writes on the website ziph.org. That's xiph.org. He writes, 192,000 hertz digital music files offer no benefits. They're not quite neutral either. Practical fidelity is slightly worse than lower sample rates. The ultrasonics are a liability during playback. There's also one more potential issue here, and that is the problem of distortion caused by having less sampling accuracy as the sampling rate goes up. So this is another potential problem. Dan Lavery writes on this. He says, there are reports of better sound with higher sampling rates. No doubt the folks that like the sound of 192K converters are probably hearing something. But clearly it has nothing to do with more bandwidth. The instruments make next to no 96K sound. The microphones don't respond to it. The speakers don't reproduce it, and the ear cannot hear it. Whatever one hears on a 192K system can be introduced into a 96K system, and much of it into lower sampling rates too. That includes any distortion associated with 192 gear, much of which is due to insufficient time to achieve the level of accuracy found in slower sampling. There is an inescapable trade-off between faster sampling on one hand and a loss of accuracy, as well as increased data size and much additional processing requirement on the other hand. Sampling audio signals at 192K is about 3 times faster than the optimal rate. It compromises the accuracy, which ends up as audio distortion. So what is the optimal sampling rate? Dan Lavery in this paper argues that it's probably something around 60K. And he's not alone. Some of the very first people to really put out digital audio tape, I think Mitsubishi was one of them, 3M was one of them. They were making the very first digital recorders, and they calculated a sampling rate around 50K. But ultimately, commercial pressures at the time pressure that number to go a little lower. So we have a standard around 48K today that's common in video and 44.1K today that's common in music. Is there a big difference between any of these sampling rates? At the end of the day, no. Use whatever damn sampling rate you like. I, in my mixing days, use 44.1 pretty much all of the time. It allowed me to work faster, better than going up to higher sampling rates. And if you really think that there's going to be a significant difference, go ahead, do a mix at a higher sampling rate. Convert that whole mix down to a lower sampling rate. Print it out both ways. Load it up into, ideally, an ABX tester, something that'll allow you to do some blind listening tests. And listen to both files and see if you can hear a difference blind. If you can, and if you do like, after listening blind, that the results that you're getting with a higher sampling rate, then bless you, stick with it, go for it. What I have found is that most people who do this kind of exercise end up saying, wow, there's really no benefit of me going to higher sample rates. I'm just going to stick with one that allows me to not buy twice as many hard drives, not have my system choke out from all the processing I'm doing twice as early, and so on. The case may be different for you. Perhaps if you are doing classical or jazz recordings with minimum processing, why not do 88.2? If you can get away with it, go for it. Maybe you'll have an additional dB or so near the very, very top of the frequency spectrum without doing any EQ boosts up there. And if you are doing nature documentaries or you are doing recording mating calls for crickets or you're putting on bat sonatas, then, go for it. Go for as high a sample rate as you can get. In the meantime, I hope that demystified a lot of this for you. What I will say is if you're sending your stuff into a mastering engineer to be mastered, then send that mastering engineer whatever resolution you're working at would be the ideal. So if you were working at 2496, 2488.2, send your mastering engineer a file at that resolution and allow them to take care of the conversion down to a lower sampling rate for you. They have tools that may be able to do that conversion even better, although again, the differences there are usually not very significant most of the time these days. That said, errors can happen, and it's a good practice to be in. If you're bummed out that you've been working at a lower sampling rate, don't be. 44.1 is fine. 48 is fine. 88.2 is fine. 96, if you want to do it, go have at it. Higher than that, I really don't understand the arguments at all. I'm not sure there are any good ones. Even at 96, I don't think the arguments are really there. 88.2, maybe there's an argument for it. Again, depending on the converter, but any benefits that you'd have at 88.2, you'd probably have at something like 60K, but that's just not a standard that exists. Well, I hope this has been useful for you. I hope it's demystified some things for you. If you think there's anything I got wrong or anything I've left out, please let me know all about it. You can tell us about it in the comments on YouTube, in the comments on Facebook. You can write in at podcast@sonicscoop.com. We'd love to hear back from you if you think we could have done an even better job explaining some of this or if you think there's anything we missed. In the meantime, I want to leave you with some of the closing statements I put into an article about this a few years back that I'll link to in the show notes called The Science of Sampling Rates, when higher is better and when it isn't. And that article closed a little something like this. There are so many more important decisions to make, whether that dB of EQ is hurting or helping, whether the bridge of the song comes in too early, whether we should move the mic or try a different one, or whether we should have chicken or tuna for lunch. Hope that helps. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Big shout out to our sponsors, soundtoys.com. They've got a sale going on right now, spring sale. It's only on until April 11th, so go check them out, soundtoys.com. Eventide, check them out, eventideaudio.com, making some killer effects as well. And SonarWorks, making real improvements that you can hear to your speakers, your room, and your headphones. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.